what I'm going to try to do is a discussion of some of the issues in, you can move one and one. The next one, okay. The issue of Jewish population and Jewish demography is an issue that raises lots of emotion, and I know here that I am quite unpopular with some of those in attendance, and popular with some others. Among other things, because I understand that based on my data, sometimes there is an allocation of the seats in this distinguished Congress. Be sure that my work is totally impartial, and so if there is a mistake, it is systematic, and so it doesn't affect one particular local situation. But besides humor, I think it's very important that we realize the complexity of the issues and the seriousness, and above all, the importance of understanding that at the basis of much of what we do, I am an academic, you are, of course, involved with public work, a keen, serious assessment of our human resources. This is certainly an idea that we all share. We wish to know what we have and what are the challenges. And therefore, serious research work is something that is necessary. It is not always easy, and I shall address a number of the problems and of the even contradictions that we have to meet sometimes. The interesting thing is that different analysts, and you have here on the display titles of different books and articles showing how different people, each of whom is very competent, a very good expert on European Jewry, would assess the situation very differently. By the way, not only in terms of demography and population and society, but also in terms of the inherent social and political process and the standing of the Jews in front of the very big challenges, some of which we heard this morning in the previous sessions. And so you have between the extreme of, for instance, Professor Bernard Wasserstein, who writes about the vanishing European Jew, and the very recent book just released by Julius Schöps and his associates at Potsdam U with the surprising title of The Road to Nowhere, which is based on the proceedings of a conference. By the way, the title of the conference was the third pillar. That is, the conference started with a very optimistic and sanguine overview and outlook. The third pillar, the other two being, of course, the US and Israel, and the European Renaissance being in the middle. And then at the end of the conference, the authors, the editors, and not me, I'm innocent in this case, on this one, the title was surprisingly modified, showing, if not pessimism, at least a certain sense of uncertainty. Now, the fact is that you can move to number 5 if you wish. Number 5, now this is probably not number 5. If you look at the small ones, then you'll get it. Demography is not a matter for narratives, hopes and fears, and very much of the debate is really based on emotions. But the fact is that we are in front of a human, a biological and a cultural process. The two are strongly interrelated, which operate on the basis of a very limited set of factors. And those factors are known in advance. They can be measured. Of course, you need, as I said, some effort. But basically, a population can change as a function of birth and death. And these are two unavoidable parts of life. With reference to a specific geographical area, in-migration or out-migration, and as we shall see, this is very important in Europe. And then when you speak of a group which is defined by some kind of symbolic system of reference, can be the Jews, but can be also someone else, the adoption of that system of values or giving up. And so we usually speak of conversion to Judaism, and it can be conversion from Judaism or assimilation. There can be a kind of latent, silent mode of moving out, but certainly this is the third way. So we have three processes, one biological, one social, and one cultural. And by the combination of these, you have a population that can be growing or getting smaller, and it can be becoming younger or older. And of course, it can change geographically and socioeconomically. This is, of course, not a research seminar, and so we need to imply that who is speaking is trying to do the best out of many data that exist. There are quite many data about the Jews in Europe, and there are many data missing. So the question is also whether in the longer term we can also think of a more systematic effort to jointly survey the trends and the patterns and the changes of European Jewry. This is something that I think is a high priority for the right management of the European Jewish communities. In any case, if you go to the small, take number 11, and just to say a word, really in the long term, just a few seconds, European Jewry, this is the way world Jewry has developed historically. I'm taking here the last 1,000 years, and this is certainly not, we do not have the time here to elaborate, but it is very important that we remind ourselves that world Jewry, which is the rose line on the top, which is in fact the dark line and the rose line merged, and then the black is on the top. That's the world Jewish population, the top line. How the size of world Jewry has changed over the last 1,000 years. And it was very small until 1700. Then it became very rapidly growing. And all of the growth was basically in Europe. So the current size of world Jewry is fundamentally the product of a transformation that happened in Europe after the beginning of the 18th century until the Shoah. This is what we are. We are the product of that enormous change in size and characteristics. Then, at the end, to the right part, you can see that the rose line, which is the total of Jews in Europe, tends to become separated from the darker line, which is the total of world Jews, meaning that either there is a diminution in the diaspora and there is a diminution in Europe, and the balance, that is what is growing, is Israel. That's, in a sense, to some extent, the children of European Jews, not only because there are Jews from North Africa and Jews from the Middle East, but that's the big change that has occurred during the last 30 years, and I shall return with a couple of observations later. Let's move now to the next. The next shows how European Jewry has changed internally in the long term. And this is, I think, something that basically everybody knows, but it's interesting to see it graphically. You see that there is the bottom line, the lower part. These are different regions within Europe, and the lower part is mostly Western and Central European regions. There has not been a very big change over time. The spectacular change, for better and for worse, has been in Eastern Europe. And so the portion that was growing was all in Eastern Europe, and tragically, the portion that was most destroyed during the Shoah was also Eastern Europe. And so you have the up and then the down. Now, part of the down is also related to the large-scale migration to the United States and to other continents. And finally, during the last 3 or 4 decades, again, international migration has played a very important role in creating a diminution of the size of Jews in Europe. But the problem is that historically we can summarize this part and saying world Jewry in ancient times was mostly Middle Eastern. At some point it became overwhelmingly European, and now it is again becoming something else. It is more Middle Eastern and American, and only quite a diminishing part has become European. Now, whom are we talking about? What's the meaning of these numbers? And I will give a few numbers, and now I would go to number 15. As you see, we are really jumping, but this is, I think, a fundamental part of our debate. The question of whom we define as being at the center, I believe, of some of the disagreements about numbers, because I am fundamentally convinced that we can agree on the numbers if we agree on a framework of definitions. And so I will define my numbers, and I will point to the internal part, which is called in English the core Jewish population, in Hebrew, Ochlusiata Liba. Liba is the heart. And that's the part which includes people who say, by the way, let me make a fundamental distinction here. This debate can be run on two different tracks. One track would be normative, and this is for rabbis and for jurists. They know the law, and the law derives in a way which does not omit exceptions. Or operational. We are social scientists. We can only look at data that are the product of conversations with people. We ask questions and people answer. Of course, you can say people are liars. I tend to believe to people, and I tend to sometimes to believe partially to what people say, and we need to interpret what people say. But certainly there is a margin of error. There is not the absolute certainty that is inherent in the legal mentality. So we have data which are based on surveys, on censuses, on Jewish community records, on other external estimates. And at the center of it, you have those who say, when asked, I'm Jewish. First of all, let's believe that someone who says I'm Jewish, given the high cost of being Jewish, as we know, will be included. Then there are quite a few people who would say, I'm nothing, I don't know, I forgot, I'm not interested. Now, quite a few of those can also be incorporated in the Jewish concept if we take it in broader terms. That is, people who have very significant ancestry, that is, the parents are Jewish, they are not so interested, but they are still in by the criteria that I am using here. So the core Jewish population, in other words, will include people who are explicitly defining themselves as Jewish, and others who are reluctant, but in the end there is no reason for throwing them out. So it is a very inclusive concept. On the other hand, you have other circles. There is on the left of the central part, a part of people who were born Jewish, but now they are not Jewish. They say, I'm a Catholic, leave me alone, I am a Protestant, I had a Jewish parent, I'm not interested anymore. These are the actively assimilated, and so they cannot be counted in for the purpose of the Jewish population, but they are sociologically relevant because they are relatives of, and therefore we should not entirely forget them. So you have that part of people who were Jewish or had a Jewish parent, but they do not consider themselves as such. Around them, you can consider all of those who are the members of their households. If I have, for instance, a non-Jewish spouse, we have a family, and so we live together, we have children. We are a relevant unit of observation, and therefore this is what I call the enlarged Jewish population. It includes anyone who is a member of a household where there is at least one Jew. This number is evidently larger than the number of the Jews properly defined. And then you have a third circle, the law of return. The law of return, which is the legal instrument of the State of Israel for giving citizenship and allowing civil rights to new immigrants, says anyone who is a Jew or a child of a Jew or a grandchild of a Jew or a spouse of any of these, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, will have right of immigration. So as you see, we are expanding significantly the framework, and it is relevant and it is important because, as we know, a significant proportion of immigration to Israel does not include Jews, but members of Jewish households, and they become Israeli citizens for most of the legal effects. And finally, you have a broader circle of those who are the descendants of anyone who ever was Jewish. And this can be very interesting if we could only do the research. During the Roman Empire, they say there were between 4 and 8 million Jews, and they constituted maybe 10% of the population around the Mediterranean. Now, their descendants, many of them are no more Jewish. They left Judaism 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. And many of the children and grandchildren of the conversos during the Inquisition, they are now in Brazil and in Argentina and in Spain, and they are no more Jewish, nor in any way connected with the Jewish community system, but they are interesting for some historical purpose. And so, evidently, the point is that you can have very different population estimates based on whatever criterion you have. Now, let's move to one little example, which is the next. And the next is based on the empirical data for the former Soviet Union, the 15 republics of what once was the Soviet Union. And you have here, based on recent data, at the center, the visible part, the identified part, that is the part that says, I'm Jewish, whether I wish or not, and whether the rabbi next door will recognize me or not, but that's what I say. And so you have a certain number, which is in the range of 350,000. But then there are the non-Jewish members of the household, and they live together, and so they are relevant, and which is nearly the same number. So one brings one, and now you have nearly the double. And then you have the children, grandchildren, and spouses, which is another one. So 1, 2, and 3. The question is, which is the right number when we speak of the Jews in the former Soviet Union? Just to give one example, I say the 3 numbers are correct. Let's simply not confuse them. When I say the smaller figure, I mean those who are evidently and clearly defined as Jewish. And when I speak of the bigger figure, this is the number of those who, if they wish, might go to Israel and receive an Israeli passport quite soon. Again, I repeat, very much of the discussion, as I shall demonstrate in a moment, revolves around this. Now let's move to 18, to forward. And here you have a few examples of what can be reasonably definition of the core and of the enlarged, and in a few cases also the law of return figures for some of the main Jewish populations in Western Europe. By the way, for those interested, I have a publication which gives country by country down to the very small communities, but these are some of the more important ones. And so you can see, first of all, several countries do have national censuses. Now, what do we do with those censuses? Should we simply throw them away or at least read them? I think it should be, first of all, interesting to read what the official publications have to say. So in some cases, the data tend to be quite similar to what we know by kind of normal knowledge. Sometimes there is a gap, which is quite spectacular. Just since we are in Budapest, I will say that according to what I know, the latest Hungarian census gave a figure of 13,000 people who had the courage to say, I'm Jewish. But certainly this is not a reasonable portrayal of Hungarian Jewry. On the other hand, we have estimates which run up to 100 or 200,000. And probably the truth is in between. But if we consider the enlarged community, that is all those who are in a household with at least one person who is Jewish, probably the figure for Hungary might approach 100,000, whereas the real number would be probably closer to 50,000. If we take a case like, for instance, the United Kingdom, the last census gave about 266,000. Now we will have a census in a few months in the UK to check what has happened during the last 10 years. But if you consider that there is some underestimate, and then there are those who are non-Jewish members of Jewish households, then the numbers may grow. And in fact, we can see the different gaps. In some cases, the gaps are very significant. Of course, one thing that has to be taken into account is the inherent trend. Is the trend growing or declining? And this, as I mentioned moments ago, this depends on how many are born and how many die. And these are data that all of you have. You should only have the courtesy to take records and to show those records around so that we can compare and confirm. And I will show a few of those cases of how many are born and how many die who are Jewish, and how many come in and how many go out. This is not so easy to uncover. In any case, there are changes. Now let's move to 21, which is 1, 2, 3. And this is how, in very broad terms, the map in Europe has changed during the last 40 years. We already know this. These are the main typological areas. We have the European Union, a small number of other communities which are Western Europe but not European Union. Then we have the former Soviet Union in Europe. And then we have other Eastern European countries. As you see, Western Europe has been fairly stable. Fundamentally, the changes have balanced off in a way that is the blue portion. It is fundamentally very stable, although there are changes. Germany, for sure, has grown very significantly, but France and England have diminished, and so there is a compensation. Italy is smaller, and probably the Netherlands is much more stable, and so on. On the other hand, Eastern Europe has declined fundamentally because of the large-scale out-migration. In fact, most of the Jews who lived in the Soviet Union have left. And they have gone to Israel, they have gone remarkably also to the United States, to Germany, and then to a variety of other countries. And so the map of European Jewry, and this is a transition of enormous interest historically, a map which was dominated for a few hundred years by Eastern European Jewry, is now dominated by Western European Jewry, which was also the case during the Renaissance. The development of Eastern European Jewry happened a little bit later. And then if we go to the next, we can show, based on the core, be careful, this is the core figures, not the enlarged figures. We can see how, interestingly, during the last 40 years, the ranking of the main communities, we take the Big Ten, in a situation which we have all lived, most of us, I think, are 40 plus, not all of the ladies, of course, but all of the men in this room are at least 40 plus, and they have seen it. So in our lifetime, we have seen that the largest single community was Russia, and then followed by Ukraine, then it was Russia followed by France, and now it is France followed by UK. It is a total continuous revolution in terms of the distribution of the Jewish presence. The numbers have gone down basically from about the second from bottom, from more than 3.2 million Jews all across the continent in 1970 to a number which is approximately 1.5 million. And distinctively more concentrated, more than 91% of the Jews live in the largest 10 countries. In the past, it was more dispersed. And if we go back before 1970, let's take the period between the two world wars, the population was much more dispersed. It is now getting more and more concentrated. So this is just to underline how mobile, how changing, and therefore how different are the problems for those who deal with the qualitative dimensions of demography. Now, there must be an explanation to this. And so I would move, first of all, to 24, which is 2 forward, just to show this is a map of Europe. This is a map of the quality of life in Europe, not Jews, but Europeans. And the red and the green and the yellow is a very simple indicator of the GDP per inhabitant. You are all aware, and we are all aware of the fact that there are very significant economic gaps in Europe. So this is a map of Europe. Would the Jewish map be affected by that map or not? This is the question that I'm going to see in the next slide. Go to the next. And the next is to be explained. It's a bit technical for those of you who didn't have Statistics 1 and Statistics 2, but very simply, horizontally, you have a dimension of the quality of life in about 40 to 50 European countries. That's the number. Let's learn the number. It means a sum of education, health, and income. It is called the Index of Human Development. So each country has an Index of Human Development. It is calculated by the United Nations. And you have each dot, which is a country, ranked on the quality of life scale. And on the left scale, the tendency of a community to increase or to decrease. And is there a correlation or not? Well, I tell you, there is a very evident correlation. The better the quality of life, the more the Jewish community tends to increase, or at least not to decrease. Meaning what? Imagine, meaning that the Jews are normal. The Jews tend to move from places where the standard of living is lower to places where the standard of living is higher. I mean, this is really the logical, pure, simple rationality when it is allowed. Let's not forget that for many years this was not allowed. There were barriers, political barriers, across Europe that prevented the free circulation of individuals. Now the legal and the political situation allows for the most, maybe not 100%, but significantly free circulation of people, and therefore there is a tendency to adjust and to become more and more similar to what the objective conditions on the ground would allow you to predict. The prediction is that places that have a higher standard of living, cities, countries that offer more opportunities to a Jewish population, which, note the following, is not just a cross-section of the Europeans, because the Jews are usually well-educated. The Jews are, therefore, interested in certain sectors of the economy where they can put to fruition their better training. And therefore, they need places which are relatively more sophisticated in terms of the facilities, in terms of the educational offering, in terms of research and development, in terms of productivity, in terms of the quality of the economy. Well, those are, in terms of the international connections, those are examples of the characteristics in a country or in a major city that can be attractive to the Jewish population. Now, I will therefore jump to, because I would like also to leave a couple of minutes to discussion, having said therefore that there is an inherent rationality in the geographical changes. The numbers are not just numbers, but they reflect a very deep process, the adaptation of the Jews to the economic framework of a Europe which is rapidly changing. So this is basically point number one. Now let's move to number 40. That's quite a big jump. And number 40, that's the Jewish vital statistics. How it goes when you compare how many people are born and how many die. Now this is, of course, evidently related to a number of things. First, the size of the Jewish family in Europe is very small, like the European family, because in Europe they have very low fertility levels, and the Jews too. Second, the Jewish population having a low fertility and the Jewish population having experienced a very high rate of intermarriage, and many of those children having not been incorporated within the Jewish community, the structure by age of Jewish communities is very old. It is a super elderly Jewish population in most of the cities and in most of the countries. As a consequence, a population where you have very few young men and women and very many elderly, they can live ad mea v'esrim. They are healthy people. They will live to the best of what today a person can do, but unfortunately there is a limit. And now look at some of the consequences. You have a few data for the Russian Republic until 2000, and you find that in a single year, just by looking at those who are registered as Jewish, and that was the situation in the republics of the former Soviet Union, in one single year you can have a net loss of 7,000 or even 10,000, just measuring how many were born that were Jewish and how many died. You take the United Kingdom, it usually had a minus. You take Germany, which has been one of the main beneficiaries of international migration from the former Soviet Union, the population has been growing, but it has been also losing, and in fact it is now the third consecutive year that by the official data of the Jewish community, the number has gone down. It has gone up and up and up since 1989, and then during the last few years, it has gone down. Of course, just by a matter of comparison, if you look at the demographic situation in Israel, which is an entirely different situation with a young population, a birth rate which is among the highest in the Western world, and Israel is a developed country. But the reasons are multiple, and separately I'm ready to explain them. Let's only say one thing. It is not only because of the religious it is significantly because of the wealthy, affluent, secular middle class, which has the third, the fourth, and even the fifth child, and therefore you have that spectacular surplus in Israel vis-a-vis the diminution elsewhere. So these are, of course, some fundamentals that are not so easy to change and to modify, and which produce very significant consequences in the longer term. I would go to 45 just to show one last table and then a couple of comments. Here we did also some projection to the future for the main countries. You have in the second column what the core Jewish population has now and what we expect it to be 10 years ahead in 2020. And we can see that the expectation for the total of Europe, including East and West, is a diminution by about 200,000 people less, especially because of the elderly composition of this and the deep assimilation of some segments of it, with differential decreases here and there, but a pattern which is particularly strong in the former Soviet Union, but exists also elsewhere. On the other hand, I want to point to an important factor which I have had not the time to discuss in depth in any way, but which is hinting at part of the solution in the long term. If you compare the Jewish day school attendance rate, that is what percentage of the children receive full Jewish education on the one hand, and on the other hand you look at the percentage of intermarriage, there is a reverse correlation. That is, the more you are able to incorporate within a meaningful educational, training, socialization Jewish system, the higher is the likelihood that not all but many of those kids will remain within the system and will not move out. And this is, of course, the dilemma of what do we do as community leaders. We have those many elderly that we have to take care of. The expense for facilities for the third age are growing. On the other hand, our mission is also to keep in and create and educate and grow a generation of young kids. Now, I would shortly go one by one. Let's move. I will basically present the last slides. They are slides where there are some. Go ahead. Just to complete, and this is one of the messages. This is the message in my view, and with this can really be my conclusion. I have outlined how much the infrastructure of economic opportunities all across Europe, most of this in the large metropolitan areas, in the large capital cities, is explaining the Jewish presence. The Jewish presence, therefore, is explained fundamentally by the possibility of having a high standard of living and by having opportunities for employment and for personal career and success and satisfaction. But it is not sufficient. What should we hope for? We should hope for what I call a community of creativity. That is, it is not only the employment and education opportunity that explain why there are Jews, but it is the intellectual life, it is the cultural life, it is the education, it is the innovation like we had in past periods of European history. And this is one of the big challenges. Of course, it is not something that can be solved from today in a week or in a month, but it is something that must elicit reflection by all of those who are devoting their time to the future of European Jewry. It has been a very short and synthetic presentation. I've cut quite a lot of interesting things. You can, if you are interested, read some of those additional points because they are published. Thank you very much. Thank you.